Project, Prophesy, Problems, Jose Carlos Mariáteguis Readings of Revolution and Nation in Peru. Melissa Moore. Modern Languages. University of Exeter, UK. M. Moore at exeter.ac.uk. Abstract. Jose Carlos Mariátegui, Latin America's foremost political thinker and writer, developed a Marxist critique of socio-political conditions in Peru, advocating radical change. But his call to develop an inventive critical imagination, a new spirit, through innovative forms of expression shows his recognition of revolutionary European politics and avant-garde aesthetics for forging a new political consciousness. Key writings: El Hombre y el Mito. El Problema del Indio reveal his interconnected political and aesthetic interests, his efforts to construct a Peruvian Marxism resolving the problems of nationhood by embracing intellectuals, workers, and peasants alike. This article examines the interplay of Mariátegui's analytical and imaginative thinking, his aestheticized political discourse and non-orthodox Marxist perspective. It shows how his very language, politico-poetic, quasi-mythic, inspired by Gramsci and Sarl, fostered a revolution in sensibility as well as in society and politics, while critique reveals that his myth of the Indian contains unhistorical reductive aspects compromising his argument. Independent and innovative, Jose Carlos Mariátegui is one of Latin America's foremost Marxist thinkers. Known in his native Peru for forging a new Marxist position, he is credited throughout the continent with developing what might be called a flexible socialism. This approach is rooted in a critical analysis of national and local socio-economic and cultural realities within a Marxist conceptual framework. In particular, Mariátegui broadened the parameters of classical Marxist thinking embedded in the experience of European class struggle, to allow for a systematic critique of neocolonial/imperialist practices, specifically the issue of uneven development in post-colonial contexts. Arguing that the problem of nation was inseparable from that of the Indian question, the historical marginalization of the Peruvian indigenous peasantry from national politics, he shaped a revolutionary, both an analytical and a visionary, way of thinking and writing about country and continent at a time of growing social crisis in Peru. This gave impetus to the socio-political and cultural movement of indigenism founded several decades before. But Mariátegui was a self-professed nationalist who advocated cosmopolitanism as a path to nationhood. His peregrinations in Europe and his European influences were key to the development of his political and aesthetic consciousness, and a practical and unorthodox Marxism, relevant at both national and continental levels. Mariátegui's political thought and writings have attracted much scholarship, although this has not fully recognized the quantity and quality of his aesthetic writings, and the inextricability of his artistic and political concerns. While his advancement of Marxist aesthetic and cultural analysis has been acknowledged by various scholars, few have systematically studied this subject and its shaping of his interpretation of Marxism. This article focuses on the conjunction of the political and aesthetic in Mariátegui's work, expressed through his imaginative use of language. Working as a correspondent in Europe for the Peruvian newspaper El Tiempo marked a turning point in the intellectual trajectory of Mariátegui. He left Peru something of a political ingenue and returned as a left-wing radical, galvanized by the revolutionary ideals and practices of the mainly Marxist intellectuals he met there. He became a staunch political activist, advocate of the experimental arts and one of his country's and continent's most inspirational thinkers and cultural figures. Central to this transformation and the forging of his highly personal Peruvian Marxist thinking and way of writing was a receptiveness to Marxist and modernist ideas and movements, rooted in European intellectual traditions. Of Mariátegui's many European influences, Georges Sorel and Henry Barbusse are prominent, as evidenced in his essays and editorials of But these writings also reveal his ability to build on and make their thinking his own. In El Hombre y el Mito, for example, he echoes Sarl's impassioned defense of socialist ideology on the grounds that, like religion, it satisfies a fundamental human need for spiritual certainty and fulfillment in a modern age of skepticism. But he goes one step further by calling for a Marxist revolution in the language of popular religion, addressing national problems of underdevelopment and a broadly mestizo, semi-proletarianized and professional public, hungry for political change but also swayed by quasi-religious lexis and symbols. From Mariáteguis displays a growing preoccupation with the problems of nation and of the Indian, which attests to his reading of works by his compatriot Manuel González Prada. However, his method of responding to these questions, through a pedagogical project and journal, Claridad, inspired by González Prada and Barbusse, shows an aptitude for developing intellectual conceptions at home and abroad by relating them to the conditions of his day. Mariáteguis' Peruvian-style Marxism was consolidated through his pioneering monthly journal A Moda from and the Peruvian Socialist Party, PSP, he founded in. His Marxism drew as much on European ideas about left-wing rebellion and the revolutionary potential of intellectuals, workers, and peasants. Gramsci's influence was also important in conciliating proletarian/anarcho-syndicalist and peasant concerns as on domestic notions of the need for national reconciliation and close observation of autochthonous realities. It was aimed at integrating large swathes of Peruvian society, especially the disenfranchised indigenous peasant majority, and building a Gramscian-like national popular hegemony. Ultimately, it was intended as a political alternative to prevailing ideological positions. President Augusto B. Leguia's positivist, technocratic, neo-colonial rule, in alliance with the oligarchic civilistas, and an opera party seeking a dubious third way between capitalism and socialism. Thus, while Mariáteguis is remembered for his construction of a Peruvian and Latin American Marxism, and his contribution to an independent tradition of Marxist thought, the influence of European thinkers, such as Sarl, Barbusse and Gramsci, was crucial in shaping his understanding of national continental realities. And he developed this through an innovative form of political, indeed politico-poetic, expression. Artful encounters, the politics and poetics of representation. Mariáteguis' new cosmopolitan cum national Peruvian Marxist position was influenced by prevailing European political trends, while seeking independence from the Soviet Comintern. But his experience of the radically politicized aesthetic practices of those involved in the avant-garde movement while he was in Europe was also pivotal. Mariáteguis recognized the revolutionary value of their attempts to challenge restrictive forms of rationalist capitalist production/representation through experimental forms of aesthetic and political expression, and he actively encouraged avant-garde writers and artists on his return to Peru in his journal A Moda, especially operista and socialist indigenists concerned with the plight of the Indian community. These endeavors and his own writings on literature, the visual arts, and cultural figures and movements from Europe, North, and Latin America, point to the inseparability of aesthetic and political concerns in the forging of his Marxism. This developed into an interplay of interests creatively consolidated through the very language shaped to communicate them. Mariáteguis' unorthodox political and aesthetic, theoretical and practical perspective is in fact most manifest in his singular politico-poetic form of expression. Exposed to the intellectual ferment and artistic experiments of Europe in the interwar years, Mariáteguis was attentive to the transformative potentiality of a poetically charged discourse. Here lies the source of his independence and originality, in his efforts to construct a conjoined politico-poetic interpretive approach through a new language and conceptual outlook, drawing on the very substance and malleability of language. Mariáteguis focused on addressing imaginatively the problems of a fragmented Peruvian modernity, and he laid the foundations for an independent tradition of Marxism in Latin America. This opposed Comintern orthodoxy while advancing European Marxist thinking by expanding its theoretical focus and practical applications. Mariáteguis' awareness of the dynamic political possibilities of language may have drawn on the iconoclastic ventures of his European counterparts, but it was honed through painstaking practice. He devised a form of political writing that was analytical and visionary, which informed and inspired his readers. His recognition of the need for a new mode of representation and conceptual outlook in Peru can be seen in his appeal to poets to cultivate an espíritu nuevo. Mariáteguis, in the manifesto-like essay Arte, Revolución y Decadencia. A close reading of this piece and El Hombre y el Mito shows the interplay of both his political and material, and aesthetic and metaphysical concerns at a textual level. The seminal Siete Ensayista Interpretación de la Realidad Peruana offers further evidence of these intertwined interests. Its very prologue, Advertencia Mariáteguis, explains the unorthodox, spontaneous manner in which these would be expressed, by responding to un imperioso mandato vital. It is in this opening piece, where he states emotively that he has written with his blood, that Mariáteguis reveals another important intellectual influence, Nietzsche. Mariáteguis' references to the latter in this prologue, and in El Hombre, though here he does not cite him by name, are not surprising given Nietzsche's key writings on the equivocal nature of language and reality, the material and immaterial. Even a cursory reading of El Hombre shows significant echoes of Nietzsche's endorsement of the metaphysical value of religious and secular myth in an age of excessive rationalism and growing skepticism, or nihilism. The recourse to Nietzschean terms and concepts in this essay, the most obvious examples being ascepticismo, super humana, voluntad de creer and even nihilista, confirms this philosopher's impact on the development of his politico-poetic approach, as does Nietzsche's style of writing, with its use of analogy, aphorism, and anecdote, and dialectical mode of argumentation. Mariáteguis drew on this terminology and these stylistic forms. He attempted to shape a poeticized form of writing and thinking through which his political and artistic concerns could be creatively conjoined. El Hombre thus affirms the restorative, renewing properties of political myth and also asserts the transforming potential of a poetically inflected language, which Mariáteguis develops in this and other essays. For Nietzsche, myth provided a means of spiritual affirmation and regeneration in a late 19th century Europe that increasingly questioned liberal, positivist, precepts and religious certainties. Like Sarl, however, Mariáteguis saw the added political value of a mythical perspective in a fractured post-war society in need of rehabilitation. As seen in El Hombre, the growing crisis of confidence in scientific rationalism, technological progress, and organized religion, namely, La crisis de la civilización burguesa, together with the prospect of reactionary utopias, mitos, preteritos, Mariáteguis, made the construction of new narratives by the left all the more important. Furthermore, he seems fully aware that for these myths to be truly new, different from those at both ends of the political spectrum and capable of generating change, like a poeticized language they had to speak as much to the senses, to sentiment, as to rationality. By drawing on and appealing to sensory, imagination, and cognitive, reason forms of thinking, a Marxist myth expressed through a politico-poetic language would be able to raise an awareness of present-day realities, to anticipate a better future. Mariáteguis knew that this was as necessary in Peru as it was in post-war Europe for countering sterile skepticism and false myths of positivist rationalism, nationalism and religion. He thus conjures in El Hombre the notion of a new Marxist mythical narrative through abstract lexis and ambiguity of tone. This myth would inspire a sense of spiritual and secular possibility, of prophecy, a consciousness of what might be and of what has come about, which appealed both to imagination and to memory. This impression of latency and awareness, the dawning of an alternative reality and way of thinking, connoted by the adjective matinal, is conveyed through a metaphor, that of el alba. Combined with the noun alma, these terms communicate the notion of a nascent consciousness and suggest that Marxist myth, and the politico-poetic language evoking it, would heighten awareness and strengthen conviction, necessary for satisfying a Nietzschean need to believe at personal and political levels. Mariáteguis thereby confirms the regenerative potential of this myth and way of writing, their capacity for consolidating a new sense of deep self, yo profundo, and community, and effecting revolutionary change. Through the writing's idealist-realist tone, he conceives consciousness raising and transformation as a political and cultural project and process. In contrast to Searle's anarcho-syndicalist myth of a general strike, aimed at polarizing the middle and working classes, and precipitating a revolutionary struggle through increased violence on both sides, Mariáteguis' idea of social revolution intended to reconcile these groups and the indigenous peasantry. His conception of revolution, like Gramsci's, as a lasting process, akin to Trotsky's notion of permanent revolution, and as a single cataclysmic event, also diverges from Searle's, which leans toward the second interpretation. In Mariáteguis' hands, Searle's syndicalist myth of urban class conflict is reconstituted as a politico-religious narrative of long-term Marxist revolution and reconstruction, capable of rallying, with its cross-class and inter-ethnic reach and millenarian dimensions, a growing number of disaffected workers and peasants during the once neo. The broad appeal of this myth would cement the necessary alliance between these social groups. Like Gramsci, Mariáteguis builds on Searle's ideas of proletarian consciousness and class conflict, seeking to reconcile city/coast and countryside/Sierra in Peru through his narrative of social revolution. Central to Gramsci's notion of a worker-peasant alliance is the formation of a national popular collective will and the development of a dramatic form of expression that would serve as a rhetorical exemplification of this will or hegemony. His recognition of the political value of an aestheticized discourse could not be closer to Mariáteguis' awareness of the potential for forging a new Marxist outlook through a poetic, or politico-poetic, mode of representation and narrative of social revolution. Furthermore, the claim made in the prologue to Siete Ensayos, that this form of expression responds to the dictates of his imagination in addition to those of reason, seems to answer Gramsci's call for Communist Party leaders to adopt a more direct, emotive form of political address. It is in fact in this prologue, particularly in mentioning Nietzsche, that Mariáteguis signals the diverse political and critical, poetic and creative elements that comprise his emergent analytical and visionary way of writing, and show his concern to politicize his readers, ultimately heightening their awareness of a possible revolution involving workers and peasants. The crucial role he assigned to the indigenous peasantry in this revolutionary struggle is implicit throughout Siete Ensayos in his attentiveness to the Indian question. The essay El Problema del Indio, Su Nuevo Planteamiento, in particular, shows his aim to tackle this question in a new way, as part of the broader problem of nation and representation during the once neo. Siete Ensayos constitutes a systematic Marxist critique of colonial and post-colonial experience in Peru, the first of its kind in the country if not also in Latin America. It provides a broad yet detailed historical materialist reading of a fractured nation carrying a legacy of dependent, neo-colonial and capitalist rule. The essays develop an Overarching political thesis and a Peruvian Marxist position through an idiosyncratic use of language. The central argument rests on attributing Peru's political and socio-economic divisions and underdevelopment to long-standing feudal structures, gamonalismo, or despotism, perpetuated by a landowning oligarchy, which had wielded political power since colonial times. Social revolution and agrarian reform are equated, explicitly or not, with the liberation of the indigenous peasantry from this feudalism and posed as putative solutions to the twin problems of nation and of the Indian. Dismantling the oligarchy and restoring land to the Indian community, ILU, viewed as a viable socio-economic institution, are specifically posited as necessary for achieving national unity and sustainable development. This would lead to an independent Peruvian nation. Mariáteguis thus identifies the underlying economic basis of Peru's fragmentation and its peasantry's marginalization, tracing their history from a semi-feudal colonial past to an uneven capitalist modernity. By reading national contemporary realities through the lens of a history of neo-colonial rule, he moves beyond a classical European Marxist analysis of capitalist development. A historical materialist inquiry combines with a post-colonial critical outlook to produce a new Peruvian Marxist theoretical perspective that resonates with and seeks to consolidate the growing anti-oligarchic and anti-imperialist sentiments of workers and peasant activists in Peru. Mariáteguis was mindful of these attitudes, among the proletariat at least in Lima and along the coast, through his journalistic and political pursuits. He launched Labor, a monthly newspaper for workers, in and with his Socialist Party founded the General Confederation of Peruvian Workers, CGTP, the following year. While less involved in peasant politics and indigenous culture, he was still eager to promote them through his writings and his journal A Moda. A preoccupation with Indian, political, culture, past and present, provided the impetus for this journal and his Peruvian Marxist position. Mariáteguis recognized the political potential of the indigenous peasantry for realizing social revolution and national reconstruction in Peru, as well as the need to include it in these processes. The peasant land invasions in the southern Sierra during the early with their appeal to the provincial mestizo middle classes, eager to contest oligarchic capitalist monopolies in local areas, only signaled for him their capacity for challenging and reversing entrenched forms of subordination and dependence at regional and national levels. He saw in this peasant insurgency, fueled by millenarian beliefs in the reinstatement of an Inca state, an Andean utopia, embodied in the post-Columbian myth of Inca and the mythical notion of Pachacuti, total transformation, concepts which could further galvanize and unify peasants, workers, and the middle classes. He was attuned to these ideas, as he had written on the Inca-inspired Rumi Maki peasant uprising of before he embarked for Europe, and on his return he had close contact with prominent socialist indigenist intellectuals, such as Luis E. Valcárcel, and Gamaliel Curata, in Cusco and Puno. He met the charismatic peasant activist, a Gramsci-like organic intellectual, Ezequiel Urviola, who embodied the prototypical Nuevo Indio, educated and politicized, an anarcho-syndicalist cum socialist, yet deeply rooted in his native Quechua-speaking culture. Inspired perhaps by Urviola, to whom he pays tribute in the prologue to Valcárcel's influential essay Tempestad en los Andes, of Mariáteguis, like other, non-Indian, indigenist intellectuals of his day, such as Valcárcel himself, asserted the links between the peasant insurgency of the time and that of decades, even centuries, before. He recognized their shared recourse to utopian thinking and, like Valcárcel, he saw that the notion of restoring an Inca state could be merged with that of founding a post-capitalist socialist order through the idea and praxis of a revolutionary struggle paralleling an Andean Pachacuti. Significantly, this appealed to both Indian peasants and workers familiar with anarcho-syndicalist precepts. Mariáteguis was aware of the capacity of both a Marxist myth and a politico-religious notion of an Andean utopia for radicalizing and uniting peasants and workers for revolution. His endorsement of these myths, through a mito conjoining them, a secular narrative of social revolution, is evident in El Hombre, of, where he conceives this as capable of fulfilling the function of religious myth in a post-colonial, post-war Peru. Significantly, however, his choice of words in this essay highlights another important insight on his part, the potentially energizing power of language, particularly in articulating this myth. Apparent in El Hombre, this way of writing is also manifest in Siete Ensayos, its very prologue implicitly equating a search for style with an ontological and political struggle for self-determination through the metaphorical, Nietzschean-inspired association made between writing, creativity, and life, and self-sacrifice, connoted by the image of blood connecting them all. From the beginning, Siete Ensayos signals a break with orthodox Marxist writing and thinking by professing an adherence to alternative modes of representation and conceptualization, those following the dictates of an imagination unfettered by rationality, no soy uncritico impartial y objetivo. Mis juicios se nutren de mis ideals, de mis sentimientos, de mis passions, a. But self-asserted passion and spontaneity in the prologue are soon disavowed by the structured nature of the language and thoughts inscribed on subsequent pages, pointing to an overriding aim not to follow the impulses of sentiment alone, but those of an emotion, a creative imagination, enhanced by the analytical properties of reason. A rationalist political lexicon predominates in most essays, but in others, or in some passages, there is evidence, however attenuated, of a more inventive use of language, the conjoined politico-poetic mode of expression seen in El Hombre. Such is the case with the essay El Problema del Indio, Su Nuevo Planteamiento, where, as will be seen, analytical political and politico-poetic discourses run parallel to each other, the second evoking, particularly in the crucial, lengthy first footnote of this text, a mythical narrative of Marxist revolution in which the indigenous peasantry plays a pivotal role. This introduces a strain of idealism into an otherwise somewhat doctrinaire piece of writing. In other words, revolutionary myths of nationhood and the Indian. El Problema is a key essay in Siete Ensayos, offering a diagnosis of and a possible solution to the vexing Indian problem, posited as inextricably linked to the wider question of nation. Mariáteguis discerns the cause of these problems as the persistence of neo-colonial feudalism, gamonalismo, affecting land tenure, labor practices and relations of rule in the Sierra, and their consequences as dependence and division. But his reading also diverges from a classical Marxist critique in his casting of the Indian peasantry as a protagonist in a narrative of revolution and national reconstruction. The nation's problems and the means of resolving or responding to them through a popular revolutionary struggle are thus conceived in socio-economic and political cultural terms, while this new Marxist perspective is articulated in a different way, through a politico-poetic form of expression. The latter's originality and its value for elucidating the problems and advancing the possibilities of Peruvian nationhood can only be determined after a brief examination of its analytical political discursive counterpart in the body of the essay. Mariáteguis' analytical critical interpretive approach, which defines his theoretical judgments, conveys a historical, materialist and revisionist preoccupation with socio-economic structures and political relations of rule, colonial and republican. This Marxist orientation is expressed through lexical repetition and juxtaposition. As expected, the political signifiers feudalidad and feudal, from the first page on, are paired with those of gamonales and gamonalismo, referring to long-standing landowning and mining interests. But words such as servidumbre and exploitation emphasize the adverse socio-economic and cultural effects of sustained local despotism on the Indian population. These terms, linked to those of individualista and liberal, indicate a liberal, neo-colonial political system. However, they are juxtaposed with other signifiers that signal an alternative Marxist order, socialista and solidaridad. Furthermore, Critica, Structura Economica, Mosses and Heco Historico suggest a classical Marxist theoretical position intent on critical structural analysis and assessment, and wholesale, material and cultural, change, reorganization. But their usage and predictable combinations also risk rendering Mariáteguis' reading reductive and deterministic. Overall, this lexis projects a didactic, pessimistic, and at times depersonalized tone, in tune with a more doctrinaire line of argument, one that distances writer and reader from each other and from the creative process of interpretation. In contrast, an alternative, emergent, politico-poetic perspective aimed at forming giacios and expressing ideals, sentimentos and passions, Mariátegui, A, can also be seen in El Problema. Most evident in the long first footnote, the quality and content of its discourse, and the attention it deserves, far outweigh its subordinated position in the text. Through its figurative language, combining spiritual, metaphysical, political and material values and concerns, and analytical and creative reflection, this approach strives to shape an inventive critical imagination. Significantly, the spatio-temporal framework evoked by this lexis is one in which the lines between external and internal, past and future categories have collapsed. Personal and social realities are thus connected, while a sense of reciprocity and the future is also conveyed. One such suggestive signifier is despota, associated with the Indian community and the stirring of a new socio-political consciousness, referenced in the second footnote by the term consciencia. Despota also appears alongside fe and esperanza linked to the notions of resolving the Indian problem and an impending revolution. This lexis, which appeals to sentiment, personal and collective, connoted by the phrase emotion mundial, suggests the manner in which a fresh political awareness is to be achieved, through emotional understanding. However, the essay carries a hidden subtext, the idea that emotion must be accompanied by rational thought, denoted by the verbs reflexiona and pensa, so that it can be personally and politically effective. The interplay of individual and communal emotion, and intuitional and rational thinking, inferred by the juxtaposition of all these signifiers, points to the possibility of an enhanced form of enlightenment. Implicit in the latter, therefore, is the notion of a consciousness deriving from within, from self-knowledge, se reflexiona, and influenced from outside by Marxist thought. The emphasis placed on self and political awareness and enlightenment, and the proposed ways in which these can be attained, give the related nouns redención, and revindication potent political as well as spiritual metaphysical meaning. Significantly, a politico-religious sense of restitution is also conveyed by the term mito, in the first footnote, which is likewise equated with emotion and thought, and the dawning, despota, of a new political consciousness. Mito, alongside alma, connoting a metaphysical, existential sense of self, both intuitional and cognizant, signals the possible connection between sentiment and thinking, imaginary and rational. This might imply the emergence of a heightened form of awareness and understanding. Together with the signifier fe, These terms echo those of El Hombre, reinforcing the conceptual link made in the latter between spiritual awakening and self-fulfillment, and political consciousness and self-determination. With their dual metaphysical and material, imaginative and rationalist, personal and political dimensions, these words elucidate the phrases Nuevo Planteamiento, in the essay's title, and Nueva Conciencia. Furthermore, they offer compelling evidence for Mariáteguis' perception that language itself, one engaging the senses and emotion, and intellectual and imaginative thought, could provide an answer or an instrument for responding to the problems of his time. In fact, he implicitly credits a revitalized Marxist lexicon, Nuevos Términos, and its associated concepts, with offering the creative means for developing a new understanding of these questions. He legado al entendimiento y a la valorización justa de lo indígena por la vía del socialismo, a politico-poetic interpretive perspective is indirectly posited as providing an enhanced framework for rethinking the diverse aspects of these problems, especially that of the Indian. El socialismo nos ha enseñado a plantear el problema indígena en nuevos términos, como problema social, económico y político. Mariátegui thus recognizes a capacity for devising long-lasting metaphysical and material, political solutions to the problem of being Indian, Creole, or mestizo, in Peru through innovative forms of writing and thinking, rooted in revolutionary Marxist dialectics. But a closer look at his politico-poetic approach in El Problema reveals a tendency that threatens its implied inherent equivalence of primacy given to immediate party political concerns over broader poetic, philosophical, and political ones. Conscious or not, this inclination inevitably calls into question this perspective's value for developing an improved critical understanding of the problems being addressed. As will be seen, this is particularly the case when its abstract lexis is mobilized for conjuring an Indo-Marxist myth of social revolution in the important first footnote. In El Hombre, Mariátegui, drawing on Sarl, vigorously affirms the transformative potential of socialist ideas and, by implication, language, conceptualizing them as a form of secular myth. Like its religious counterpart, Marxist myth would foster belief, fe, a Nietzschean will to life, necessary for a sense of self, alma, yo profundo, and agency, acción, all too attenuated in a post-war modernity. But he goes one step further in El Problema, by invoking a Marxist mythical narrative of wholesale social revolution with an indigenous peasantry at its helm. The spatio-temporal parameters of this myth encompass local, Sierra, and national, Sierra and coast, pre-colonial past, and present future spheres. This widened sense of space and time is evoked through lexis, politico-poetic, or politico-religious, tenses, present and perfect, and tone, utopian idealism, particularly in relation to the Indian community and a revolutionary struggle. The conceptual connections made between spatial and temporal categories, the peasantry, and a Marxist revolution are reinforced by implicitly associating the latter with national redemption, redención, lending Mariátegui's Marxist myth millenarian dimensions. This Indo-Marxist narrative of revolutionary struggle, and the struggle itself, are in turn legitimized as being the only viable solution. Tacitly the formula salvadora, to the problems of nation through the pairing of the adjective revolucionario with those of nacionalista and socialista, no es posible ser efectivamente nacionalista y revolucionario sin ser socialista. These terms are all indirectly linked to that of indigena. The impression of imminence and viability conveyed by this myth of national restitution is bolstered by the notion of a dormant, or incipient, indigenous national political consciousness waiting to be roused, despota. The Implication is that this political awareness will, through a forthcoming Marxist revolution, bring about the reinstatement and propagation of autochthonous comunista, forms of organization fractured by the forces of gamonalismo and capitalism alike. This suggestion is strengthened by allusions to a rising tide of Indian rebellions, el resurgimiento indígena, in the present, inspired by la idea de la revolución socialista. If the idea/myth of Indo-Marxist revolution is posed as a remedy for the nation's problems, references to currents of international Marxism, las corrientes revolucionarias mundiales, and capitalism, capitalismos imperialistas extranjeros, expand its spatial possibilities, indicating that, much like its cosmopolitan Marxist counterpart, it is capable of inspiring resistance against neocolonial/capitalist interests in Peru and beyond. Through this mythic construct, a Marxist revolutionary struggle is rendered as an unfolding collective project and process of nation building. This involves an objectified body of Indians, del Indio, and mestizos, and Creoles. The presumed readers of the text, connoted by the first-person plural voice at local and, national levels, in both the present and the future. Through spatial, temporal, and conceptual convergence, evoked by politico-poetic terminology, a myth of a Peruvian Marxist revolution is validated as an inevitable, all-embracing, lasting solution to the parallel problems of a marginalized majority and a broken wider body politic. Ultimately, it is posited as a means of enabling national integration and reconstruction, these acquiring politico-religious dimensions through the use of emotive, evocative signifiers, such as redención, while those of fe and esperanza impart a sense of political and metaphysical idealism or utopianism. This mood is compounded by the use of rhetorical devices, interrogation and exclamation marks, and switches between the first-person singular and plural narrative voices toward the end of the first footnote. This footnote thus reads like a manifesto for Mariáteguis' Peruvian Marxism. But while immanence and idealism might suggest a Nietzschean sense of the eternal return offered as a philosophical and THIRD volume. No. More. volume-more.html// PM. Secular antidote to or compensation for skepticism and a utopian Marxist notion of impending socio-political restoration, they may also ultimately militate against the very analytical visionary, politico-poetic reading of national and continental, historical development sought by Mariátegui through his new Marxist lexis, Nuevos Términos. This is because the language used to express a sense of transcendence and proximity also conveys an idealized partisan representation of the Indian community and its role in revolution and nation formation. As such, Mariátegui risks reproducing essentialist, romantic Indianist or class-based Marxist, and binary, Sierra/Coast, Indian/Creole conceptions of them and the Peruvian nation. Contrary to expectations, a close look at the Indo-Marxist myth embedded in the first footnote reveals its rootedness in an elevated, homogeneous and anachronistic depiction of the indigenous body politic, del Indio, that only seems to undercut its historical and political legitimacy. Implicitly located in a distant past and remote rural setting, their socio-economic and cultural practices and relations dehistoricized, viewed as Inca, and imputed with Marxist value, Sistema Comunista, the Indians, El Pueblo Incaico, assumed predisposition to Marxism given the survival of their pre-Columbian forms of collectivism is misguidedly naturalized. Cast as a uniform class of peasants, they are also seemingly divested of cultural, or ethnic, specificity and diversity, their identity as new Indians, or mestizos. The complex realities of migration and cultural mestizage, the many, semi-proletarianized Indians and mestizos involved in mining, commercial agriculture, and trade, in and in between highland communities and coastal cities appear to be disregarded by this mythic construct, which imparts a reductive, class-based and deterministic reading of revolution and historical development, and the part played by the indigenous peasantry in these processes. There is some irony, then, in Mariáteguis' critique of a liberal bourgeois, romantic Indianist language pseudo-idealista, that diminishes this population and its experience of modernity. In the absence of an established bourgeoisie, Mariátegui rightly saw the Indian peasantry as playing a crucial part alongside the proletariat, in a forthcoming Marxist revolution in Peru. However, while he rendered indigenous socio-economic structures and cultural values as compatible with Marxist ones, this gesture only seems to sanction his idea of a Peruvian Marxist political order and his myth of the revolutionary struggle that will bring it about. Posed as the only tenable solution to the country's problems, this revolution and its mythical narrative are irrevocably equated with national political and cultural restitution. Mariátegui's ahistorical, idealized reading of the indigenous community and social revolution in El Problema raises an important question, however: what, other than a personal resolve to promulgate a set of party political, Peruvian Marxist notions of national development can account for its conceptual and representational shortcomings? Political exigencies, due to mounting state repression and polarization, as much within as outside the left-wing opposition, evidenced in his year-long standoff with Haya de la Torre and the founding of his Socialist Party, both in clearly had a hand in hardening his ideological position. Limited knowledge, personal and social scientific, of the Indian people may also account for a reliance on cultural and class-based stereotypes of them. But a scrutiny of the politico-poetic interpretive approach in El Problema suggests that the philosophical idealism and critical creative thinking and language apparent in El Hombre were indeed compromised by his growing party militancy, and that of others on both sides of the political divide toward the end of the decade. The all too elevated, emotive, and didactic rhetoric deployed in the conjuring of a myth of a Peruvian Marxist revolution involving both peasants and the proletariat in El Problema, speaks persuasively not just of a journalist's or an activist's attempt to galvanize a public into radical action, but also of a political leader's partisan concern to garner support for his party. In many ways, the lexis, tenses, and tone of the politico-poetic perspective in El Problema seem to be mobilized for evoking an Indo-Marxist mythical narrative aimed as much at orienting political sentiments in a party direction as promoting self-consciousness and independent thinking. Party political idealism and motivations manifest in the powerful sense of imminent revolution and the prominence given to the Indians' role in this, and the task of national reconstruction threaten to short-circuit the transforming potential of this myth, undercutting the hermeneutic value of an interpretive approach aimed at tackling creatively the problems it was devised to address. If the revolutionary capacity of this perspective also rests on its engaging his contemporary readers in an interactive process of interpretation, one should ponder the likely identity of Mariátegui's readership. The first-person plural voice and the pronouns nos and nuestro suggest a body of urban, mestizo, Peruvians, sympathetic to the indigenous cause and assumed Marxist adherents. The indigenous community itself seems largely to have been written out of this narrative of its self-liberation, by having its voice suppressed and being passed over as a possible readership. In the essay El Preciso de la Literatura, also in Siete Ensayos, Mariátegui censures an inauthentic indigenous poetry and prose penned by intellectuals outside or on the fringes of native culture. La literatura indigenista no puede darnos una versión rigurosamente verista del indio, see only when Indian writers and artists themselves contribute to these artistic forms termed indigena rather than indigenista, he argues. Would these constitute a representative account of indigenous experience and, by implication, shape a new Indian, mestizo, readership? While he asserts this, however, his own mythologizing, his naturalizing of the indigenous community may only have perpetuated what he criticized. It is for the modern reader of El Problema to judge how far autochthonous authorship and readership have fostered new narratives of social revolution and liberation in Peru, fulfilling the creative possibilities of Mariáteguis' politico-poetic perspective to find fresh solutions to the problems of nationhood. Conclusions. Mariáteguis' originality, his revolutionary contribution to Peruvian Marxism and nationhood, lies partly in his adapting an orthodox Marxist critique to socio-economic conditions in Peru during the once neo. But he also realized the crucial importance of melding this political philosophical analysis to a language, a form of representation, which could appeal to the broadest political community. His critique and writing sought to embrace the middle class, intelligentsia, Creoles, mestizos, the proletariat and, most importantly, the underrepresented Peruvian Indians. He hoped that they would all be engaged in a unified project of Marxist revolution. This he strove to achieve through a European-inspired socialist thinking, embedded within the potentially fertile ground of indigenous, Andean mythical notions of community, generation, and rebirth. Such thinking was articulated in an invigorated language that appealed to a myth of restitution, through a political but also a poetic rhetoric. This became the mainspring for a revolutionary spirit and a force for change. Key writings on politics and the arts, such as El Hombre, Arte, and El Problema, implicitly answer his call for a new spirit of revolution in Peru. The interplay of political and aesthetic conceptions, and analytical and imaginative thinking is evident in his politico-poetic approach. This signals an attempt to consolidate a new political consciousness, necessary for wholesale change, a revolution in sensibility as well as in society and politics, serving to ascribe quasi-religious, even mystical, dimensions to political and material conceptions and concerns, thereby enhancing these. This perspective highlights Mariáteguis' propensity to think and write poetically and metaphysically about Marxist politics. As seen in El Hombre, a political conception of consciousness, belief, and change revolution is articulated through a metaphysical, religious vocabulary, espiritu/alma/fe, culled from a politico-poetic lexicon. Drawing on Searle's ideas about the affinity between religious myth and socialist ideology, through their shared ability to stir passions and induce faith in the face of growing secularism and class conflict, Mariáteguis' mythic Marxism reveals another important source of inspiration, however, millenarian notions of an Andean utopia fueling indigenous peasant insurgency in the southern Sierra. Recasting Searle's anarcho syndicalism in terms of an Indo-Marxist myth of social revolution and restoration, expressed through a spiritually inflected political language in El Problema, Mariáteguis sought to appeal to and conciliate proletarian and peasant interests alike, and those of individuals like him, non-Indian, indigenous intellectuals and sympathizers. His evocation of a revolutionary struggle in the language of Andean utopianism places the Indian community at its forefront. In El Problema, the nation's problems, unequal relations of rule and land ownership, gamonalismo, and their possible solutions, social revolution, are conceived in Indo-Peruvian Marxist terms. The recent wave of peasant land invasions confirmed for him the Indians' political agency. But, expressed through a politico-religious poetic lexis, Mariáteguis' reading of the challenges of nation-building also affirms the transformative possibilities of language. Evident in both El Problema and El Hombre, This lexis embodies these energies, focusing attention on itself as well as on the socio-economic and political realities it is representing. Significantly though, this does not appear to be the case when mobilized for delineating his myth of Indo-Marxist revolution, where Mariáteguis' new perspective seems primed for consolidating party political allegiances. Thus, while the abstract, suggestive terminology of El Hombre, and at times El Problema, may inspire a critical and creative outlook in his assumed readers, underlying partisan motivations also seem to diminish this prospect. In the long first footnote of El Problema, a Peruvian Marxist mythical narrative of revolution implicitly yet effectively denies the indigenous peasants their notional active participation in this struggle. In fact, their idealization writes them out of this process. Through references to a bygone pre-Columbian era and continued communitarian practices, Mariáteguis' politico-poetic approach connects this population and its world, natural and social, with a would-be Peruvian Marxist order by ascribing Marxist dimensions to them. Represented as an undifferentiated, dehistoricized indigenous community, partly coinciding with romantic, noble savage, or social realist, passive, victim, Indianist or intellectual indigenist constructs, this people's ontological and political specificity and agency seem disconcertingly disavowed. Furthermore, by assigning them a predestined role in the presaged revolution and a future, re-envisioned, integrated nation, the reader's attention is deflected from the concrete details of this role, the alliances having to be formed and the aims and outcomes being fought for. With an Indian peasantry allegedly predisposed to Marxism and cast in a leading position in a Peruvian Marxist revolution reinstating a putative socialist order, the revolutionary struggle is legitimized by being naturalized. This dispels the need for historical materialist analysis and strategy. Growing party political preoccupations and exigencies from early repression and tensions with opera and the Comintern may account for this reductive mythical reading of revolution and national reconstruction, establishing its purpose and complexion. After all, this over-rhetorical evocation speaks persuasively of an attempt to inspire more than the party faithful. Nevertheless, while seemingly compromised for partisan ends, the language invoking this myth may also, by drawing attention to itself and its limitations, paradoxically affirm its unrealized creative potential. A close, critical reading of El Problema and other writings in which Mariáteguis hones his politico-poetic perspective sharpens this awareness in the reader. While he may have been unaware of the ambiguities and contradictions of his own evolving discourse, these become a creative source of tension and agency for his readers. Endorsing its interpretive, revolutionary value, however, more in theory than in outcome. But Mariáteguis' own attentiveness to the transforming possibilities of a revitalized language and thought is also an important stimulus for his readers. This awareness is seen in his efforts to develop new ideas through the very substance of this language, and in his attempt to construct a new paradigm, nuevo planteamiento, for understanding the Indian problem and promote wholesale change. His restless search for a fresh mode of expression, for reframing familiar questions, created new opportunities, not just for the ways in which this language and its referents could be understood and used, but also for molding critical readers of his work, readers who could become new political subjects by writing, and writing themselves into, their own narratives of revolution and liberation. Like Gramsci, Mariáteguis recognized the potency of an aestheticized political discourse for galvanizing his followers and forging an alliance of forces through which the proletariat, the peasantry, and their organic intellectuals would shape fresh socio-political and cultural roles and realities for themselves. This insight and these efforts, however fledgling and fragmentary, ultimately confirm the fundamental value of his writerly language. A hybrid form of expression, which, rooted in ambiguity, both lexical and political, elicits diverse readings and new narratives of a Peruvian nation in flux and reformation during and after his lifetime.